Hi, everyone. Welcome to One Decision. Our new podcast just dropped its first season where we discussed everything from the man who forged a deal with North Korea to Donald Trump's drone strike on Qasem Soleimani. And we even had a couple of nuggets make it into late night television in the US, something about Trump's formidable makeup skills. But we're here today with a new statesman on the sidelines of a very quiet, very strange UNGA to tackle the transatlantic relationship. And joining us are two diplomats, two journalists, and a crisis communicator. So who knows, maybe we can even solve it right here. So let's get to our guests. We have Jeremy Cliffe. He is the international editor for The New Statesman and the host of the World Review podcast, joining us from Berlin. Hi, Jeremy, welcome.
Hello from Berlin. Good to be with you.
Good to see you. We have Ambassador Ryan Crocker, a career diplomat. He was the US ambassador to Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, all the best places. And he's the recipient of a Presidential Medal of Freedom. Ambassador, great to see you from the West Coast of the US.
The inland Northwest, actually, between the mountains. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. And we have Jonathan Powell, former chief of staff to British Prime Minister Tony Blair. In fact, the longest serving senior advisor in the Blair government, also was appointed by David Cameron to be special envoy to Libya. Jonathan, you are in London, correct? Good to see you.
I am. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
And last but not least, we have right next to me, Johanna Maska. She's the CEO of Global Situation Room and a former aide to President Obama. And you know what? It seems like only yesterday we were here listening to President Obama's final speech at UNGA, and you were organizing it and I was covering it and probably bothering you.
I was saying this morning, it is so much more fun being on the outside than having to deal with all of the logistics on the inside.
So I'm Michelle Kosinski. I am currently the host of One Decision. I also host an hour-long world news program from Istanbul when I'm not in Switzerland. I covered the White House and the State Department for CNN. I was based in London for NBC News, and I also spent a lot of time in Afghanistan. So we're also happy to see all of you joining us from home or wherever you are, maybe right here at UNGA. And join us with your questions too. You can also ask questions anonymously if you want to. And we like to consider this to be sort of a free flow of information. We like to cover angles that aren't necessarily the obvious ones. And we want it to be a kind of no holds barred discussion. Say whatever you want, be free, just like France has been lately. Say what you feel. And of course, we wanted to start out focusing on, when we had planned this, we were going to focus on the transatlantic relationship after the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban. But then along comes another shock with a $66 billion price tag, this AUKUS deal, which of course France is not too pleased about. And we have, if you haven't noticed, we have two Americans on the panel, two Brits, and I'm all over the place. I'm an American who lives in French-speaking Switzerland. So I'm going to do my best to be offensive, defensive, and neutral all at the same time, hopefully. So let's start with you, Ambassador Crocker. As a career diplomat, tell us how you've been watching these relationships strain lately, and how much of it is the US's fault in your view?
Well, that's a great question, particularly the notion that maybe it all isn't the fault of the U.S. Look, like millions of Americans, I greeted the coming to office of President Biden and his team with great relief. When you look at his cast of characters there, Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Wendy Sherman, Avril Haines, it's the A-team. These are people who know how the world works. And the president laid it out right at the beginning. America is back. The world doesn't run by itself. And that made, of course, the subsequent unraveling of events all the more painful. I basically endorse President Biden. I've never done that as a career diplomat. So I've got jilted suitor syndrome here. That the Afghan thing was a total mess strategically and tactically. And then the submarine deal, it now appears that there was simply no serious consultation with France at all. And again, Jonathan in particular would relate to this. The recalling of an ambassador is a really big deal. And when that ambassador is from a NATO country, a major NATO country, it's even a bigger deal. So on the strategic level, again, I was, before I knew all the backstory, I was pleased to see the outreach to Australia this suggested, and the tougher position on China, which I think is necessary. But this may be a team that sadly has got the substance right, except for Afghanistan, but are coming unglued where we least expected it in terms of coordination, forethought, consultation, all the things that they've been good at in the past.
Yeah. All right, Jonathan Powell, here at UNGA, all of the headlines leading up to President Biden's speech today have been overshadowed by this stunning rift involving France. And France was particularly dismissive to the UK, calling it a fifth wheel, a junior partner, not even worth recalling an ambassador over. Sorry to bring up those bad statements there. Hopefully you don't feel too bad about it. But the real ire, of course, was reserved for the US. And there have been other disagreements between the US and France lately. France recently very publicly made this statement about how they feel whatever the US does, they're going to keep a military presence in certain areas where they feel it's necessary, really setting up a contrast there. And also there was some tension between the US and France at one of the global meetings recently where France has been very vocal in wanting to talk to Russia and trying to iron out that relationship and collaborate more, whereas the US has wanted to freeze Russia out a bit. How would you see where this is going? This rift now, where are we headed?
Well, I think that's to be decided, but I think that you'll find a great sense of disappointment at the moment in Europe and including in the UK about what's happened in the United States. Like Ryan, we were all rooting for President Biden. We wanted Trump out. We wanted America to be back. But America doesn't seem to be back in quite the way that we had expected. We thought America being back meant it would be involved in decisions, that they would be consulting, that there would be multilateralism. And again, in his speech today, the president talked about that. He talked about the need for multilateralism. But there's been a failure, I think, both on communication, as Ryan said, that they have not told people in their allies what's going to happen. In the case of France, in the case of Afghanistan, they didn't tell the Brits what was going to happen. When the Brits asked for more time at the airport, they said no, or they didn't even answer, they just pulled out. So I think there's a real problem of consultation. The question really is this a tactical issue, as Ryan says, or is this strategic as well as tactical? In other words, it's extraordinary that such a professional team should behave so unprofessionally as they have so far. But does this actually portend a strategic change, that in fact America is not back at all? America is actually on a straight line from the Trump policy of isolation of America first, that you're no longer going to get involved in the security issues of the world. And if that's the case, we in Europe and we in the UK have a really big problem.
Jeremy, I wanted to get your thoughts on the way France has responded to this. Now, granted, they lost out on this enormous deal, and that is a big deal, but France is so outwardly furious with these officials using words like lies and treason, betrayal. It's all extremely dramatic. To what end is this airing it out publicly? And what do you think this will affect in the future?
I think you have to recognize that some of this is, of course, domestic politics. There's an election coming up in France next year, and Macron knows as well as any of us that it's important to show himself to be standing up for French national interests. He will have learned from Chirac that a bit of America bashing or a little bit of sort of tension in the relationship with America can go a long way. But I think to write it off as just a sort of pre-election theatre act, I think would be to dismiss the genuine hurt felt in France. And it's not actually just about the money. I mean, you mentioned this figure, $66 billion. I understand that only about 8 billion of that was going to be spent in France. The majority was going to go on US technology and on Australian shipyards to build the submarines. it's much more about the sense that France wasn't trusted, or that there wasn't the trust in that relationship. And, you know, Scott Morrison, the Australian Prime Minister, was in Paris as recently as June. Of course, he and Macron also met at the G7 summit, where, if reports are to be believed, just down the corridor, Morrison, Johnson and Biden were stitching up this deal. And, you know, Morrison assured Macron that the deal was still on. And then to find out about it literally in the news, as I understand Macron did, must have come as a terrible blow, in a sense that France is not trusted as a partner. And just one final thought on this, particularly on the kind of transatlantic angle. You know, if I were the Biden team and I wanted to consolidate my international commitments to focus on the domestic issues, which I know are important. America is a divided country. There's a lot of healing to be done, and also the competition with China. I would want a partner in Europe who looked quite a lot like Emmanuel Macron and France, a partner willing to take more responsibility, a partner willing to bring Britain post-Brexit into the European security fold, a partner willing to challenge Germany, where I am, and where we're in the middle of an election campaign where defense and foreign policy and Europe have barely come up at all, challenge Germany to do more. A France that was active in the Sahel, for example, that was showing an interest in taking responsibility for countries, for regions like Iraq, where West Africa was. And I think I would want to make this relationship good again. And I think to treat a partner who in so many ways is actually quite aligned with what Biden wants to do so poorly seems like a terrible mistake.
Yeah. And Johanna, what is your take? I know you have been saying that at this point, you don't really think that this rift matters much right now.
I don't. You know, I come to it from a different perspective, because I grew up in Galesburg, Illinois. Galesburg lost Maytag. Galesburg used to be a bustling manufacturing city, and now it's a shell of itself. A lot of that is blamed on globalization, and people in Galesburg voted for President Obama and then voted for President Trump. I've seen in my own family a real skepticism of globalism and of, you know, the very relationships that we all would recognize have kept us safe for a very long time. So, you know, I come to it knowing that people in Galesburg care about their jobs, and they want to hear from their president that he's protecting their jobs and their interests. I don't think that's going to change. But I do think that President Biden has a different tactic than President Trump, in the sense that he actually does care about bringing other countries along in isolating China's bad practices or other countries' bad practices that have led us all to some of these isolationist policies. When it comes to France, I had a Bush administration official this weekend say to me, "I can't believe France is mad at us. Who would have imagined?" And I just had to laugh so hard, because it was during the Bush administration that I was in France, and the French were like to my husband, "Don't even try to speak French to us, you American. You know, you guys are the problems." And I think France is mad at us a lot, and I love the French. But I think that, as Jeremy put this, it has as much to do with domestic politics. And I don't think they're going to change their alliances over this. I think it's going to be a blip. And I think ultimately, look, Biden reframed his position today as the first time we are out of war in 20 years. Now, looking ahead, we're looking at trying to confront the challenges that our generation, that our communities care about, technology problems, China's growing, you know, threats to America and to the world order. And I think you're going to see him continue to make that point stronger and stronger as we go.
Let's talk about President Biden's speech, since we just heard it. And I feel like every UNGA, we sort of, as Americans, especially as journalists, we would wait with bated breath to see what our leader is going to say. Is he going to call people out? Is he going to try to smooth things over? But then immediately after the speech, you sit around, you're kind of like, well, wait, you know, what did he really say that mattered? What was it, all just generalities, or was there more there? And so today, I think we heard him talk about how relationships are important, but then again, that's what he always says. Of course, relationships are important. He didn't really overtly try to address this issue with France and Britain and other allies. Anybody have any takeaways from what we just heard? Anything stick out to anyone? Gentlemen, I know not everybody was able to hear it, but any of the points that we know were some of the headlines coming out of there that you want to mention?
The main point I took away from it was that he was trying an act of reassurance. It's a rather funny thing for a president to have to try and do in a speech at the UN, but he was trying to reassure his allies that he did mean it when he was talking about multilateral approaches to having allies, to working with allies to achieve things. But the trouble is that, for example, on what he was saying on global warming, which is entirely commendable and exactly the right thing, how is he going to achieve that unless he gets into a relationship with China, where we can do something about global warming? So I saw lots of verbal reassuring, but I'd like to actually see some acts. And although we in Britain really love seeing the French getting angry like that, it's one of our favorite pastimes for several centuries. Actually, I fear it does have some long-term consequences. If President Biden wants to get a solid front against China, splitting off the EU like that from the UK is actually a big mistake in the long term. If he ends up with UK and Australia against China, but Europe somewhere in the middle, floating, sort of not against China, not for China, he's not going to achieve his objective of trying to isolate China. He's going to achieve exactly the opposite. And I think this is one of those things that we'll have pleasure with at the moment, but repent in the longer term and really regret having done.
Ambassador,
I'm going to jump in on this if I can, because that's a really interesting point. I would agree completely with that. My question for Jonathan would be, do you think that was the message that Boris Johnson would have delivered to him?
I fear not. I fear
that's
Boris
a great
Johnson.
question.
Boris Johnson, unfortunately, thinks this is absolutely wonderful. He said today that the transatlantic relationship is in the best state it's been for several decades. So he actually thinks he has a better relationship with Biden than Mrs. Thatcher had with Reagan or Tony Blair had with Bill Clinton, which I find somewhat surprising. So I'm afraid that what Joe Biden has done unintentionally is played into Boris Johnson's notion, which is global Britain is in alliance with the United States and against Europe. Whereas, in fact, we happen to live in Europe. And if we're going to have any global policy, it's going to be based on a relationship with France, our nearest neighbor, and with the EU. And so he's simply pandering to that approach of Boris Johnson that's going to lead us down a very, very dangerous path.
Well, remember just a few years ago when Trump delivered his speech at the UN, and it was all America first. There were open groans in the crowd. You could just see the rest of the world bristle to this hardcore America first program. And that's what dictated the relationship over the next several years. I feel like from the United States point of view, it lauds the relationships when it needs them. It points to examples where the US has needed allies and vice versa. One of the biggest examples that they used most recently was, of course, the fight against ISIS, defeating ISIS. And we would constantly hear Obama say, America needs these partnerships to tackle the world's biggest problems. However, when the US needs to go it alone, sometimes in very abrasive ways, it wastes no time in doing that. And do you feel, Ambassador Crocker, that the US shoots itself in the foot sometimes when it makes that abrupt turn to saying, well, okay, allies, you might not agree, but we're going to do this regardless?
I think it depends a lot on the level of consultation that would precede a position like that. And that's, again, what I find so troubling. That is not the way the administration approached Afghanistan, and certainly not the way they have approached this submarine deal. I prior to that blow up with France, when I was trying to think of what Biden could do as concrete steps to show that we are asserting a positive form of global leadership, I would have said China. Getting out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a huge strategic blow to ourselves, self-inflicted, obviously. But now I'm afraid that the way this has been handled, it's going to be harder, not easier, for the United States to play a critical role in containing and managing China. Again, a self-inflicted wound. The other thing I would get out there, just as a positive suggestion, and he certainly talked a lot about that today, is COVID, to truly lead a global response to the COVID pandemic. I mean, we all know the appalling figures coming out of Africa of vaccination rates less than 5%. Well, I would think there is still an opportunity here, should he choose to exercise it, to, again, not unlike George W. Bush and the PEPFAR initiative, which he should have gotten more credit for than he did. But having now said that, I'd ask Johanna, how does it play in Galesburg?
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say, Ambassador Crocker, is the idea of getting back into TPP is something that you saw both the progressives and Trump run away from, because in Galesburg, they see that as a threat to their jobs. And so if Biden wants to do that, he's going to have to sell it domestically. And I agree with you entirely that that would have been a better strategic way to isolate China's bad practices. People in Galesburg didn't see that. And instead, when Trump had the rhetoric of America first, they believed him. And the problem is, as COVID was breaking out in China and we had no oversight of what would become a global pandemic, Trump was negotiating for their purchase of some of our crops, which one, they haven't even held to, and two, it isn't much of a give for the Chinese with 1.4 billion people to ask, to have some American crops. Like, that's something that they need to feed their people. So I would argue that Biden is going to have to make those arguments here domestically. And the other question I have for Jonathan is, I agree with you, stronger strategic approach would be engaging all of Europe, but didn't Brexit break the UK from Europe more than the US is doing that?
Well, certainly, but I mean, Brexit was a deliberate act by 52% of the British people to break Britain away from the EU. But that doesn't mean to say we don't have a relationship with our nearest neighbour. The ridiculous scene we have now is of Britain trying to be a member of ASEAN. No one in ASEAN wants us. We don't live in Asia. We're not going to have a Pacific policy because we're not a Pacific power and never will be. We need to concentrate first, if we're going to have a policy outside the EU, of having decent relationships with the EU. We deliberately, in the Brexit negotiations, rejected the European offer to negotiate a new understanding with us on defence and Europe and on foreign policy. We have to have a relationship either with the E3, with Germany and France, or with the EAS, the wider EU foreign policy, if we're going to start building a global policy. To rush off and think we can build an alliance with Australia so many thousand miles away is just a joke. We are a European power by geography, and you can't get away from geography. So in the end, we're going to have such a policy. When they launched their big foreign policy statement last year, there was nothing in it about Europe at all. It actually had more words on the Antarctic than relations with Germany. And they said, when asked privately off the record, Number 10's answer was, our Europe policy is pending. Well, you can't have a Europe policy pending for years and years. You have to have one after Brexit, and only then can you build the rest of your foreign policy.
On TPP, because China is such a unifying force in many ways, because and even ideologically, for the West to be unified in that, Obama could not have sold the TPP any better than he could have. I mean, I remember on a daily basis, they were hammering home all of those benefits and listing them. But the Trump supporters and this Trump force, I feel like they just wanted to reject it on the basis of liberalism and globalism being dirty words. And then we saw Trump, privately thinking about how can we get back in this? Yeah. And now today we see China wanting into the TPP, the very opposite of why this alliance was formed. The thought that China will be a force in the TPP now is so ironic. Jeremy, what are your thoughts?
I was just thinking, I mean, it goes to show how some of the elements that we ascribed to Trump's eccentricities and extremism are continuing through into the new era. And this is a pattern that we saw before, where the US pulled out of multilateral formats and China moved in. And we saw it to some extent with the World Health Organization. We saw it to some extent with the World Trade Organization. And now it's happening with TPP or CTP. TPP, as it's now called.
Yeah.
And I mean, on that point, actually, I had a question for the Americans present, because I mean, I was really struck, Johanna, at the way that your response to my point about France and the sort of perceived betrayal in this AUKUS deal was to go to Illinois and the voters who Biden needs to keep on side. And I think there are elements of this in what I've seen from his speech at UNGA. And there's obviously all this idea around a foreign policy for the middle class. I know Jake Sullivan's very interested in this. And it's often sold as if Biden's domestic mission to reunite the country and bring these sorts of voters back on board is absolutely of a piece with, absolutely complementary to the kind of alliance building it has to do internationally, the return of multilateralism, relentless diplomacy, as I hear he said at the UN.
Right.
But I think maybe we all need to be a bit more honest about the fact that these two elements of his presidency are in tension, and there are going to be moments when he has to choose which is the bigger priority. This is obviously TPP sounds like a classic example of that. To rejoin that arena, to build that trade and economic relationship with the partners that it wants to bring on side in the contest with China would make total sense from his sort of self-image as the president who would make America strong in that kind of long-term contest, but obviously it doesn't make so much sense in domestic politics terms. And so I suppose my question, whether it's to Ambassador Crocker or to you, Johanna, would be, is there any way around that? Do you see any means of reconciling those two sides of his presidency, or do we just have to accept that they're at odds?
Well, it's very difficult given the deep divisions in America. It's very difficult for an administration like Biden's now to sell anything to do with foreign policy, especially progressive foreign policy. Go ahead, Joanna.
Well, and I'll defer to Ambassador Crocker, but I would say in terms of politics of it, because I come from the politics, I was involved in campaigns. I got to the White House by working on a campaign. America is remarkably divided. We had an assault on our Capitol. We've never seen that. We've never seen the Confederate flag being flown in Washington, D.C. at our Capitol. I don't think we can forget that. And, that division is still very much alive. Unfortunately, both sides of the aisle, I would argue, do this where they say, the other side is wrong about everything, and I'm going to resist everything. If you see the progressives, they're saying they aren't going to negotiate on an infrastructure deal, which we drastically need infrastructure in our country. But they say, until we have it all, we're not going to pass anything. And they're winning by doing that. The same is true of Trump. And I would say, Jeremy, we cannot divide this, that Trump has an infrastructure in Iowa already in place. He has a state director. He has people who are already building for his return to power. He is very much an arrogant person who believes that only he can solve problems. There is no way I see him not run. I believe he will run, and I believe that he can win the Republican primary right now. And I would argue with anyone who says that I am wrong, because I see it in my own family where people say, Trump wouldn't have let this happen in Afghanistan. Trump wouldn't have let this happen, wherever it is. Trump would have protected us from this. And the truth is, he would have pulled out. He would have blamed it on the Afghan president. He would have said this was, all their fault, but he would have messaged it better than we're messaging it. And so because of that, what's happening in Galesburg is people are believing a president who I believe was a snake oil salesman and did nothing for the people of Galesburg, Illinois. So, I think you cannot divorce it. I think we're going to see this problem continue because, as he did today, Biden promised that he was going to build infrastructure around the world. We can't get an infrastructure package passed in the US, which is a big problem. So in order to lead globally, we're going to have to solve our problems domestically.
Also, every time you see President Biden pledge any amount of money to a problem somewhere in the world, as he did again today during his speech, you see some backlash in the US of saying, look around, there's so much poverty here. Yeah. There's people without jobs, even though the US economy has been growing. People react to every US attempt to intervene overseas, at least Biden's opponents do, with some sort of retort that we should be doing that here. Why are we doing that? However, they're also very quick to criticize the way he pulled out of Afghanistan. So I feel like there's still that very Trumpian element that is going to oppose really anything Biden tries to do overseas as the wrong thing to do. Ambassador Crocker, you were about to say?
Yeah, just on Afghanistan, we need not to lose sight of the fact that Trump was the one who set us up for failure in Afghanistan by agreeing to talk directly with the Taliban and excluding the Afghan government. As soon as he did that, the rest of the narrative was in place, except for the rapidity of the collapse. He delegitimized the Afghan government, demoralized the Afghan national security forces. He gave Biden a horrible hand, and then Biden made it worse. And I think what we're seeing now is Donald Trump would have done it all right, and nobody is challenging it. Well, he's the one that set us up for that defeat. And just again, to jump in on some of the things that Johanna said, all of which, again, I would agree with. The depth of the divide in this country is unprecedented. The January 6th insurrection had an element, again, that I think Johanna touched on, that's been underreported. What those insurrectionists did was what the Confederate Army could not do in the Civil War, occupy the Capitol. God knows they tried. So when you see the Confederate flag in a mob making an assault on the seat of our democratic government, that goes way beyond just another Trumpism. I mean, this is a really, really serious moment for America. Finally, on that score, settling back as I am into my own country after 40 years in only the best places, school board elections.
Yep.
Unlike just about every other major country, our education policy and resources are directed and done by unpaid volunteers who are elected to be a school board. Well, these board elections, and one out here, have gotten enormously contentious and frankly very frightening. It isn't about the kids anymore. It's about this huge political divide.
Yes.
I'm a mother of a young child who's in public school. And so I would say, Ambassador Crocker, you're so right. And what's happening is our kids have been out of school for a year and a half before they were welcomed back in. And now there's COVID closure after COVID closure. And so parents are dealing with the real stress of not having childcare and getting frustrated with things like teachers unions that, they blame, that Trump blames on not having schools open, when in reality, it's a more nuanced conversation, but it's easy to make organizations the demon. And I think we need to really look at rebuilding that trust. And I think that's one of the things, the huge hurdle the Biden administration has, and I won't say that they've tackled it perfectly, is trying to restore trust in institutions is going to be a very long battle. And frankly, 4 years is not going to be enough because our families are hurting. They feel like they don't have schools. They feel like they haven't been heard. We need to get back to the core of supporting some of those things. I mean, civics education we need in our country. And so as much as, yes, I can sympathize with the French getting upset about a contract, and I love the French and I would love to visit the French and I would love to have wine in France. The truth is, Biden has to worry about the problems in America, or he will not be president, and we may have a Trump 2.0.
Well, I think the ambassador raised the fact we all know that Trump set the stage for this.
Yes.
That is, happy to be ignored by Trump supporters, of course. But the way it was then handled by the Biden administration, I'm not saying that it was by any ill intention, but the way it played out has now added so much fuel to people who are going to oppose Biden next round. And it has added fuel to those who are independent, who might not vote Democrat next time around. And that now shapes foreign policy going forward. So this one incident could have an effect that changes the next election and then changes foreign policy going forward. Jonathan, you were about to say something.
Yeah, if I could pick that up, plus what Ryan Crocker was saying about Afghanistan, and put the two together. I think in his speech to the UN, President Biden made an important point, which was that this is an inflection point in history. And that sometimes oversaid. I've lived through,
I laughed when you said that, because I said every single president has to say that. But go ahead, continue.
Absolutely. But there's an interesting point. I actually lived as a witness through both the fall of the Berlin Wall in Berlin and then 9/11 in 10 Downing Street. And you knew those were inflection points at the time. You didn't quite know where they were going, but you knew they were inflection points. And we made terrible mistakes after them in what we did. That led to the renaissance of sort of nationalistic Russia and the disasters that we faced in Iraq and Afghanistan. So if this is an inflection point, the decisions that for what is inflection 2 have not yet been made. And that's what I think is important. It's not so much what President Biden has done now, but I think that it is possible that the departure from Afghanistan will be seen as such an inflection point and will be seen actually as the end of the American century, which has been long heralded but never happened. But if we make the wrong decisions now, and America does go back and thinks the answer to populism at home is to concentrate only on the domestic and not on international, that will be a tragic mistake that will lead to the end of the American century, and an inflection point we'll always regret later on. So I hope when he says that he wants to participate in the world events, that he wants to be part of multilateralism, he means it, and that we can actually have alliances to unite people instead of this awkward negotiation, this awkward alliance that has divided people rather than uniting them.
I would argue I know there's a lot of thought of the post-American era. My colleague has this, anticipation of a post-American era. And I actually, as desperate as our circumstances seem right now, I believe our best days are actually ahead of us. America's populations are changing. The dynamics in the US are changing. We have diaspora communities from all over the world. Los Angeles looks like we project the rest of the United States to look like in 2050, where we have no racial majority. I think what you're going to see is actually America lean into more strategic alliances and try to solve problems around the globe with the freedoms that we have here in America. To do that, we have to solve for some of our inequities, some of the issues that have historically plagued America, to empower people to solve problems like clean water, like clean technology. And if we do that, I actually think we can be a stronger partner to Europe. We can be a stronger partner to countries that we have not engaged, I would argue, enough for too many years.
Yeah, that's very true. But the divisions in America are so deep, and more America has trouble paying for its problems at home because nobody wants to pay for them. Nobody wants to pay taxes. I digress though. And Jeremy, I wanted to ask you, as we look at this rift, and it's, we're seeing the UK, the US, and France have this very public squabble. And observers always like to say, anytime there is an issue among allies, what a great day for Russia, what a great day for China watching this happen. I don't know if that's always necessarily true. People like to talk about that. But this kind of abrasion among these allies goes back much further. Remember when Donald Trump accused GCHQ of spying on him and wiretapping him in the White House? And before that, remember President Obama actually did spy on and wiretap Angela Merkel and her phone calls and her texts. So this has been there for a while. There have been these incidents that have maybe sown some seeds of distrust or anger among these allies, haven't there?
Yeah, there was that excruciating press conference here in Berlin with Angela Merkel, where he said something to the tune of, we've both had our phones tapped by the NSA. There always have been difficulties in the transatlantic relationship, and we'd be kidding ourselves if we were sort of harking back to some supposed golden age, around 2003 when Jonathan was in 10 Downing Street. There was obviously this fraught relationship over Iraq. You had sort of Donald Rumsfeld talking about old Europe and new Europe, and the divisions opening up in how Europe related to the US. So I think one shouldn't lose perspective, even when things get as bad as they have been over the last few weeks. But, and this goes to Jonathan's point about recognizing historical turning point when we're living through one. I think Europe really could go either way on the bigger picture over the next decades. You see it here in Germany. There is a genuine ambivalence about, first of all, and this speaks to the points we've been discussing about the domestic issues in the US, Trump's possible return, because people here wonder whether they can rely on a partner where America first could well be back in 2024, 2025, or one electoral cycle beyond that. And secondly, because there's a kind of really real open question about where Germany's interests and Europe's interests lie. I mean, particularly here, where the economic relationship with China is so integral, where people have become quite comfortable with a very mercurial relationship with Beijing, to some extent, even with Russia too. We just saw the completion of the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. I really think it's entirely open to question where Europe ends up. And again, I come back to my point about Macron being the European leader who is at least trying to forge a conversation about Europe's security future, who wanted to be Biden's point person in Europe. That was his big push at the Cornwall G7 summit. There were those images of the two of them sort of arm in arm on the beach there. And you have a European leader in Macron going to the polls himself next year, who wants to make Europe more self-sufficient, who wants to take more responsibility. But I think, despite the long-standing French skepticism about the transatlantic relationship, is an Atlanticist within his own country's political class. And I think we could do with a bit more recognition, perhaps, from the American establishment of the extent to which this does all hang in the balance, and how fragile the future of the transatlantic relationship might be.
I want to go to questions now from people who are watching, and I think there's this very tantalizing one. So feel free, our panelists, to jump in as you will to this one. Someone has asked the question, hasn't Biden alienated France and others much more than Trump ever did? Anyone like to take a stab at that?
I'll try that one. No, because we firmly believe that Biden shares our values. We didn't think that Trump shared our values. And it's very hard to have an alliance with someone who doesn't share your values. So we feel more that Biden is a sinner who can reform and actually do what he said he was going to do, which is to build alliances, to work with people, to inform them when things are going to happen, to consult them. If that happens, then I think you'll find not just the UK, but Europe will be delighted. Whereas for Trump, there's no amount of reforming that could happen to someone who didn't share your values.
The other thing I would say about President Trump is he made policy through tweets. So, to the degree that you can't trust America to give you a heads up because you learn it from the press because there's been a leak or something like that. President Trump was a kind of leader in which he would change things just via tweet and wouldn't notify his national security advisor. For example, firing a national security advisor via tweet. So, I think that there's a lot of rose-colored glasses in looking, I guess, forward and not remembering that at the first UN General Assembly meeting, the world laughed at President Trump. And I'm not going to ever say that he didn't have some points that, I think Americans were very much concerned about that the Biden administration needs to address. But I'm saying the way in which he enacted his business and then his, career in the White House was kind of a showman's game. And that is something I'd be curious for Ambassador Crocker to say, how does that work in diplomacy?
Diplomacy, as I've experienced, it's always a show. It's sometimes tragic, sometimes uplifting, sometimes just farcical. But we have some non-farcical issues out here on the table that I think are really, really important. Kind of weaving together what you said, Johanna, and then Jonathan and Jeremy just now. If this is the end of the American century, it was actually a little over half a century, not a century. What is next? And frankly, that terrifies me. I mean, if you look at the 20th century without American leadership, what did you get? 2 world wars and the Holocaust. we didn't trigger those. This is something Europe managed on its own. And if we are no longer willing or able to lead, then what's next? Well, it defaults to a balance of power system. And what's wrong with that? Nothing until it gets out of balance. And again, that is what we saw in the first half of the 20th century, again in Europe. So we are talking incredibly high stakes here.
Yeah. And Ambassador, I wanted to ask you, you know, the world watches France react, and there is an element of entertainment to it. As a journalist, it's kind of refreshing to see diplomats not react diplomatically, but it's been so dramatic. Do you feel that it's something like this, a very visible rift, even if it is somewhat narrow in its scope, does this add fuel to the West's adversaries? And do you bristle at seeing a problem being handled this way now?
Well, that last it's a great question for me because, you know, diplomacy is a whole heck of a lot about process and getting the process right. And I was struck by Jonathan's remark, and I think he is correct to say that for all of the missteps in what is still his first year, that President Biden does indeed share the same basic values with NATO and the EU, and that Trump never will. And that's crucial. It does give Biden time, but he had better not screw things up any more than he already has. France, well, we all like to take a jab at France. We need to be careful with that right now. I hope we're not going back to the day of freedom fries as opposed to French fries in the US Capitol cafeteria. You know, let's get a grip here. Let us, again, talk to those who share our values and have demonstrated that over the years and figure out what the way forward is. Is it US leadership or is it something else? But again, as we look at that global leadership issue, my fear is not that China is going to replace us as a global leader. They can't. We remain the indispensable nation in that regard. And that is, again, why I worry terribly about some kind of balance of power regime is going to replace us if we choose not to lead.
I have a question for Jonathan and for Jeremy, and then we'll take another question, I think, from our audience. But Jonathan, does Europe even really recognize the US anymore as what it was? I mean, this is an America who was willing to elect a leader like Donald Trump. It was willing to go along with those policies and those wild statements that, you know, years ago, we would never expect to come out of the United States of America. That Europe watches these events in the end days of the Trump administration. Does Europe still view the United States as it did, as the leader of the West?
I think it does, but I think that we are very nervous, and we're very nervous because we can see this possibility, as Joanna was describing, of Trump coming back. So say, for example, we sign up for this Australian-American alliance against China. What happens if Trump is elected and decides he's going to have a war over Taiwan? Are we joining in that because we signed up for the alliance? We don't want to sign an alliance with Trump on something like that. We could find ourselves in terrible trouble. So I think we're very, very nervous. And that's why we were so delighted when we heard that America was back, because we thought it was the old America that was coming back. We didn't realize that the Trump America coming back was more polite. We want the change to go back to being involved and giving leadership. And I sincerely hope, for the reasons that Ambassador Crocker gives, that's what we're going to see.
Okay, so Jeremy, we talked about the depth of the relationship going back, but also these most recent events in Afghanistan and the deal with France. In a real sense, how do you see these differences or rifts, whatever you want to call them, affecting the relationship in the near term? What will the practical effects of these problems be for those who are watching events?
I think it will intensify some of the discussions within the EU about this idea of so-called strategic autonomy. which as I've said previously on in this webinar is not necessarily a bad thing as far as America is concerned. It can be seen in a positive light as Europe taking more responsibility for itself. But obviously the French government's trying to use the opportunity to stir up these discussions. Hasn't had a huge amount of emphatic support from other European capitals, but Macron will have other opportunities. I mean, France has the rotating presidency of the EU in the first half of next year, and he wants the centerpiece of that to be a big summit on European defense. So I can see it moving the EU further in that direction. I can see AUKUS in particular possibly further alienating Britain from the EU. It does feel a little bit like Britain saying we've chosen a side. And as Jonathan said, there's this great deal of wishful thinking about Britain being a sort of an Indo-Pacific power, and neglecting the fact that so many of its own closest relationships and interests are in Europe, and in Europe's own near abroad. You know, we forget that Britain is very exposed to what's happening in Russia and Belarus and Ukraine and Middle East and North Africa too. So I think, you'll see an accentuation of those trends. I think there will still be a receptiveness to the Biden administration. I don't think it's too late to pull it back. There was a lot of goodwill when he was elected. He is someone that Europeans think share their values. You can see that in Pew does a lot of polling of electorates in different countries and how they respond to different world leaders. And he is obviously drastically more liked in Europe than Trump was previously. But he's got a lot of work to do. There is this fear what happens if Trump comes back, or someone worse and more dangerous and possibly more effective than Trump ends up in the White House with his America First agenda. There's a lot of trust to win back. I think the climate talks in Glasgow in November, the COP26, might be an opportunity for him to do that, to make common cause with the Europeans and others. But I'll just finish on this. I've heard some worrying sounds from certain European capitals about what Biden's actually going to bring to the table at the COP26 summit. And this obviously goes back to this point about him keeping an eye on those voters in places like Illinois who are worried about gas prices and don't want to see huge sums of money being spent on decarbonization in the US or elsewhere. And I wonder if that might be his kind of, my concern is that he'll blow that chance too.
Well, I think that's why he's focusing on these cuts in methane. And methane is, of course, a huge contributor to greenhouse gas. So already the Biden administration is making these sounds like we're going to be a leader to make dramatic cuts in methane emission. And I feel like that's a way of splitting the difference of not cutting back too much on coal and fossil fuels, or at least not speaking of that as much as methane, which hopefully will be more palatable to people in Galesburg, Illinois.
Well, before we move on from the points that Jonathan and Jeremy were making, I actually think that now is the time to set up guardrails against any one of our countries falling, victim to a populist showman leader. And I actually would like to see some of those guardrails, like to the extent that we are protecting human rights, that we're standing for moral values in the world. I'd like to see that be part of it. And I actually think that the Biden administration would very much welcome setting up those guardrails so that one person or one individual does not have the power to change alliances in a way that they could decimate human rights or, upend one world order by themselves.
I wanted to ask you that because you were inside the Obama administration, and you know a lot of the Biden people too.
They're confused often.
Okay, so yes, I mean, I think the world expected that the Biden administration would be the Obama administration 2.0. But okay, so we've talked about the events of the Biden administration. We talked about the earthquake of the Trump administration. When you were inside the Obama administration and we had those spying rifts with Germany, we had Obama getting involved in Brexit, going to London and campaigning against Brexit. Many reacted with like, what are you doing here? Like, this isn't your business. But
we also tried to save Sarkozy. I don't know if you remember that. So the first time we met with Sarkozy, he surprised us with 500 of his closest friends when we were going to meet him before Strasbourg, Baden-Baden. And then we were late to see Chancellor Merkel, and she's like on time, right? So there's this great photo of Callie Schell being like, you're late. over the course of 8 years.
Obama also, as he's there dealing with these close relationships, he's also watching the rise of populist movements elsewhere in Europe. So what was the thinking at that time? That's when the world is really effing struggling with globalism, and Obama's desperately clinging onto the shreds of it, saying, no, everyone, globalism is the way to go. Were you guys worried about those transatlantic relationships then?
I think there was a level of arrogance that there shouldn't have been. I have a lot of retrospective thoughts about our administration and how we could have been better. But I think there was an arrogance that we had, changed kind of the coalitions, that we had the blue wall, that we had protection in America for, things that we could sell, good jobs. And I don't think that I think they absolutely underestimated the power of disinformation. And so, to that extent, we're seeing that play out. I hope none of us underestimate these things again. I hope we take these lessons and that we actually build those guardrails in place so that one arrogant person cannot change everything for humanity's future. Because I think that's the other thing, that technology is allowing us to see people's lives in a different way than we've ever experienced it. And so I do think the world is changing. I think the Biden administration is unfortunately in many ways stuck in the Obama administration. I think they're trying to get out of it. I think the question is, who are the innovators who are going to come to the table and help them get out of it?
Yeah. Okay. We only have minutes left, everyone. It has been a great discussion. Any last words from our panelists?
Yeah, I do have one, actually. Afghanistan. This was going to be a focus of this program, but now we've moved on. Afghanaware. Nobody's really talking about it too much anymore. And when Joanna makes the point on, let us stand up for our values, for global human rights, well, we just sold out half the population of Afghanistan.
Yes.
The women and girls that we encouraged to step forward, get an education, run for parliament, start a business, join the military. We got your backs.
Yeah.
Until suddenly we didn't have their backs anymore. And I've been particularly discouraged. There are very few progressive female voices in this country saying publicly, we have done a terrible thing to the women and girls of Afghanistan. So I think we kind of need to take a look inside about how we are exactly standing up for our values, because we not only harmed our national interests in Afghanistan, in my view, at least, we stained our values.
Jonathan, any last statements, or do you think this Afghanistan incident will have lasting effects?
I do, and I agree, Ambassador Crocker, that we may have left Afghanistan, but Afghanistan is not about to leave us. We're going to be living with the consequence. We in Europe, anyway, are going to be living with the consequences of the way we departed Afghanistan for some time to come. Because you were appealing for everyone to stand up for human rights and for liberties, and we certainly didn't do that in Afghanistan. We have deserted people to a system that is anything but that. I also worry, as we've been talking about in this conversation, about it feels a little bit like the run-up to the First World War, with a whole series of alliances and new alliances slapped on top of them, and a series of mistakes, and it was no one's fault, and we tripped into it. And hopefully we're not going to do that. The world is different than it was in the beginning of the last century, but or century before. But I worry. This looks like something that could go horribly wrong. And it all depends. It depends on the decisions we make now. As I said, I think this probably will be an inflection point, but it could be an inflection point somewhere good rather than somewhere bad if we make the right decisions now.
Great points. Jeremy, your last thoughts on the transatlantic relationships?
Actually, I was going to just quickly circle back to that thought about America pulling out and leaving space for others to move back in. I cited a number of examples of that earlier on, and of course, Afghanistan is the most striking recent one. No sooner had the last American plane left Kabul airport than China was moving in practically, and obviously has a lot of interest in mineral resources in Afghanistan, wants to knit Afghanistan into the Belt and Road. And I think that speaks to a broader truth, which I hope kind of gains perhaps some more recognition in the US, which is that a lot of these subjects, America as the indispensable nation, can't always be neutral. You know, often it is a choice between lesser evils. And I think that while recognizing that a degree of consolidation is possibly needed, that the American electorate doesn't necessarily want to have as many international engagements or whatever than previously, that, you know, it's making choices now seemingly kind of with a rather short-term mentality that as we've all of us sort of discussed here, will have long-term implications and that may not be reversible. So sort of a gloomy final thought, but I think an important one.
Well, gentlemen and ladies, I think we've proven what we set out to do, that 2 diplomats, 2 journalists, and a crisis communicator, we really can solve all the world's problems. We're available. Thanks for your input, everyone. Thanks for joining us here at One Decision. And some good news, just this morning, Apple Podcasts has named One Decision among its new and noteworthy podcasts. So be sure to check us out. Sorry we couldn't get to more questions, but thanks for joining us. And panelists, thank you so much for your great input. It's wonderful to see you, if not in person.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.